Hello and welcome to the Can We Ask You This podcast. My name is Rosalind.
My name is Corey.
This podcast is a place to hear real stories from real people, gain perspective, get uncomfortable, and maybe even create some change. We want to hold space and give a voice to people who have been hurt by the church or wonder if they have a place in the church. Can We Ask You This is about listening, learning, and truly seeing each person as invaluable in the eyes of God.
And today we have Zach Hare joining us. Zach has been hurt by the church. Go into kind of his whole journey through hurt, through a lot of the pain, and even his healing journey as well. A great episode. There's a lot to learn.
So many good things.
So many good takeaways. I know you will be encouraged by the end of this, so you'll want to listen to the whole thing.
Yeah, and Zach is somebody who's very well spoken, very easy to learn from. So many good nuggets.
So smart guy.
He actually knows what he's talking about.
Yes.
But really incredible episode. So
let's jump in. Well, Zach, welcome to the podcast. We're so glad that you are joining us today to hear about your story. But before we really jump in, share a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, your family, hobbies, work, all that kind of stuff. So we're here to listen, and let's get to know Zach a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. That's a good point. That's a good way to start. Yeah, that's who am I? Who is Zach? I guess I'm a lot of things, identities to different people, to myself, different areas. But I grew up actually in Airdrie, so north of Calgary. I was there probably up until grade 5, I believe. And then I have two parents, Heather and Jamie, two brothers, Nathan and Jared. We actually used to attend First Alliance Church. So yes, in grade 5, I ended up moving away to Ontario, where my mom's job took us out there. My whole family moved. We ended up moving around a lot. So we moved to Stratford, represent Stratford, Justin Bieber. Just gotta put that out there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did you know him?
I did know him, yes.
what? Oh.
Yeah. Went to school with him.
Tell us more. Yeah. Oh, can we ask you,
get him on the podcast.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, him and Haley. Yeah.
right. Yeah. You guys are on a first name basis.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So I was there only for a year, and then my mom's job again moved us. So we ended up moving more north of Toronto to a place called Sunderland. And around there, we moved 2 different times to another little small town. We lived on a house in a little place called Wagner Lake. So we were there for a long time. I would say I grew up, my adolescent years were in Ontario. And then when I graduated high school, I ended up moving actually out to Abbotsford, where I went to go do a 1-year program through Columbia Bible College called Life Teams. And Life Teams actually was an incredible time. I would say for me personally, I grew up in a Christian home, but I would say Life Teams actually was where I probably would more say I identified as a Christian, and that was when I was 19. So did that for a long time, and then, I wanted to work with Youth Unlimited or Youth for Christ. Ended up moving back to Calgary, where I really thought, hey, I really like doing youth ministry. I'm going to become a youth pastor, so I ended up going to Ambrose. So I went to Ambrose, did that whole thing. But I ended up actually working in residential treatment with young offenders. So I did that for a long time while I was doing my education. Ended up as well working for the Calgary Drop-In for a long time before moving back to Ontario to pursue more education, which has led me to where I am now, which is more education. I can get into that in a bit, but just some of my hobbies, I guess. I love to cook. Cooking's fun. Yeah.
Can you come to my house, please? We don't cook. Well, we do, but probably not as fancy as you.
I love to cook.
That's cool.
Gordon Ramsay's the man.
Nice. Do you know him?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, I wish I did. Yeah.
You have to ask. Who knows? Who else do you know?
Right?
Yeah. No, I love to cook. What else do I like to do? I love to read. I'm a huge nerd.
Yeah.
I love reading different stuff on theology and psychology, all the different types of stuff. I love to travel too. Probably the best place I've ever traveled to was Cambodia. I love Cambodia.
Oh, cool.
It's a great country, great people. And my dog. I love my dog. She's a chocolate lab. Her name is Whistler.
Aw.
Yeah, she's the best. She's crazy. But yeah, just hanging out with people, good conversations, good food, stuff like that.
Yeah. Any significant others that you'd like to shout
Oh yeah,
out as well?
my wife.
I mean, I'm glad the dog got a shout out.
Yes, Vanessa. Vanessa's my wife.
She's lovely.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you know her. You know her too, Vanessa.
I don't think I do.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Bring her when you bring Justin.
Yeah.
We'll get together.
Yeah. So we actually got married in 2019 here, actually at first.
Cool.
Yeah, we've known each other for a while though. Like we knew each other, I think, like 7 years prior, just as friends, and then we just like always came across each other's paths and things like that. And then yeah, so we're currently now living in Kelowna, British Columbia, and yeah, it's been good.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that you're here in Calgary,
Yes.
so we can record this in person and not over Zoom.
Yeah,
So,
makes a difference.
it does. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about you knew you wanted to go into youth ministry, and what was the process of starting into that, and what were your expectations of what that would look like? How did that go?
I would consider myself, I don't want to say a failed attempt at being a pastor, but it was more of just a weird, windy road.
Okay.
I mean, I'm still actually ordained with the Alliance, so I still hold my ordination. But yeah, so I went to Ambrose, wanting to be a youth pastor. I think for me, it really came from a place of wanting to really have deep connections with kids, really good, deep connections.
Where was that coming from? Like, that was just a passion God gave you, or just did you like?
I think it was a passion
Yeah.
God gave me, but also too, I kind of came up in youth ministry in the early 2000s. So that model of youth ministry was kind of modeled for me.
It was a good time to be.
It was,
Yes,
like good
the
punk
best
rock,
games. Yeah.
skateboarding, like
It's
that's,
just good.
yeah, pastors in skinny jeans. Like,
Right, plaid shirts, skinny
yeah.
jeans. Yeah.
So it was good. Yeah. So I think it was modeled for me.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, because I kind of am in like that sociology, psychology type world, I was seeing kids with issues in the church that I was really wrestling with some of the answers. And even to like in my own personal background, like this is part of my story and my brother's story. My eldest brother has been struggling with the disease of addiction for a long time. And I remember him and I had an amazing conversation. And he was like, Zach, he's like, we were raised in the same home. Understood the same Jesus, like God is good. He loves us. He can restore us. But how come I have to struggle with addiction? And I was like, that's a great question. I don't know. I don't know. And I couldn't give him an answer. I don't know. And so I just kept finding myself being like really wrestling with those types of questions. And I thought the only place for me, like this was actually a thought for me, and I wrestled with this for a long time. The thought I had was if I want to be in ministry, I had to work as a vocational pastor in a church pastor.
Can you explain what that, for people that don't know
Sure.
that terminology?
Yeah. So for me to work in ministry, I had to be involved in a church, like working in a church, whether as a youth pastor, associate pastor, senior pastor, which is weird because I actually started my ministry career in the parachurch.
Right.
So meaning, outside of the four walls of the church, Youth Unlimited, Youth for Christ, YWAM, there's all these different types of organizations. But I think just this idea came to me and I kind of just clung to it, and it's like I feel if I need to advance in this, I have to go down this road, but there was something in me that didn't fit that, but I kept pursuing it. Yeah, so I ended up going through Ambrose. Like I'd mentioned, I ended up getting involved with different organizations like Hall Services, the Calgary Drop-In, and I loved that type of work, but there was always this desire in my heart that's like, no, like I want to be a pastor.
Did you feel like it gave you some credibility to be called a pastor in a church, working in a church, or was it just, step A, do this, step B, do this, that you'd kind of grown up thinking?
I think so, but also at the same time, I had this passion and this desire to work with people who had questions about God, but didn't necessarily fit the church. And so I actually felt like that too a little bit.
Okay.
But again, if I wanted to go anywhere and be in ministry, I felt like having the title of pastor kind of gave me that in to be able to have those conversations. And also too, I mean, just with history and what it shows, like, and I've experienced it too as a parachurch worker in these organizations, to go and have partnership with the church, like the mission wasn't really the same and the vision wasn't really the same. And so there was always a tension there of like, I'm a parachurch worker wanting to be in relationship with church and asking for funding and all these types of things. There just was a discrepancy in the vision and the mission of where people were going. And so I personally felt that in myself as well.
Okay.
And so finally it came to the point where I finished my degree and I applied to like 13 churches across the country and I didn't get one job.
Wow.
Yeah, I always made it to the final interview, but I never got the job. And I think it had to do with, like, not necessarily, my theology wasn't wonky or like way out left field or right field or whatever. It always came down to the point where I didn't necessarily feel like I'm going to go there and just do youth group, run games. Like, I really wanted to have deep conversations with kids who are really struggling. And I would mention that in my interview. And they always picked the other person. And so I never got a job.
That's so interesting, because that seems like a thing that we need,
You would
right?
want. Yeah.
Yeah. But what did that do for your mental health or I don't know,
Or like
spiritual health? Like,
Yeah. Well, I remember at that point where I was like, well, maybe it's not meant to be. And that has actually been a part of this journey of me of understanding calling. I felt like my calling was wrong. I felt like I didn't get the call right.
You answered somebody else's call or something?
Yeah. And so I was like, maybe I'm just not supposed to be a pastor. And so I ended up actually going back and working, continuing to work in the social service field, and I loved it. And it was actually at that point in my life where I met Brent Sellers. I don't know if Brent's still a youth pastor, but he was a youth pastor at Rock Point way back in the day. And I remember at the Legacy Youth Conference at Ambrose, I got asked to come and do a presentation on faith and suicide. And so I remember I came and I did this presentation. It was incredible. There was lots of kids there, and lots of kids were coming forward saying, hey, I'm really wrestling with this tension of, like, I've got this thing, but I don't really feel safe talking about it in my church, or I don't really have the language to talk about it. How do I make sense of this stuff? And so I remember Brent Sellers actually coming up to me after, and this was the first time I ever met him. And he said, hey, he's like, I think you really are doing something good here. We want to invite you to come write a curriculum for Rock Point Church, and we'll help you put it together. And we want you to do a teaching series at our youth group on mental health in the church.
Cool.
Wow.
Yeah. So Brent really took a chance on me and invited me to do this, and they paid me, and it was incredible. And so I took that whole summer off, because at that point too, I was actually let go from my job at Hull Services. I got let go because there was just a lot of stress going on at that time in my life. Like I'd mentioned, my brother's addiction, and then there was all my personal stuff going on, and I wasn't taking care of myself. And I look back at it now. I mean, I was super upset with my boss because I was there for like 7 years. But at the same time, I look back at it now and I was like, that was such a blessing, because she was like, you're not fit to be working with some of these most vulnerable peoples.
Right.
And so I actually look back at that now and I was like, yeah, I think that time was good. For me to, and like I had like a mental breakdown, and yeah, it was just bad. So I took that time to just kind of rest, and like I said, there was a lot of stuff going on personally in my life at that time, and I took the summer off, and I did a research study of different churches throughout the province of Alberta, and what are the top 5 things that they're seeing in their youth groups. And so it turned out to be pornography, anxiety, depression. There was 2 other ones, and I wrote this like huge curriculum on it, and I still have it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And so we launched it at Rock Point, and it was great. And, kids were learning stuff. They were coming forward, talking about some of their struggles. And so I was still wrestling with this idea of like, what does it really mean to be a pastor? And like, how do I make sense of these 2 worlds that I kind of find myself in? But I didn't really see them fitting together in the local church context. But then it was at that point too, where that summer I went out to Vancouver to go to an Envision summit or an Envision conference. So Envision is this area of the Alliance where, I don't know, how would you explain it? Like,
yeah, young leaders,
stuff like
Yeah,
that.
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. And so I went out there and I met my past boss who was in Mississauga, and we got talking, and, he was asking me about what do I do and kind of my background. And he learned that I had, like a social work background, social service, type stuff, but then also pastor theology. And I guess their church wanted to hire somebody with those 2 areas to kind of come to their church so that they can do a lot of outreach. Because again, this is like inner city Mississauga.
Sorry, you said your past boss. Does that mean that currently he's your past
No,
boss?
not
or
anymore.
At the time he was
At the
still
time
your
he was
past
my boss.
Oh, so you knew him before?
No, I didn't know him before. I met him.
Past boss from now.
That's what
now.
I'm saying. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah. So you had just met this guy.
Correct.
Okay.
In Vancouver.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just clarifying.
Yeah. No, that's good. Yeah.
If anybody hasn't had their coffee like me, they're caught up to speed.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts to this. So anyways, he offered this role, this package, right, that fit.
That sounds so up your alley.
That's what I thought.
Sounds
Right?
perfect.
That's what I thought. Yeah. There was a lot of beautiful pieces to it. We'd be working collectively as a team and, doing a lot of outreach. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, is this my chance after like 3
This
years
is
at this
it.
point of, well, I guess I'm just not supposed to be a pastor. And then now this falls on my lap. And at that time, I was getting married to Vanessa, my now current wife. And I remember I went to her and I said, hey, I was like, would you ever move to Toronto? Because she's from Canmore. And she said, there's no way I would ever move to Toronto.
That's fair.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what?
Yeah.
So we actually turned the church down for like 5 months. And we said, no, we're not coming. They just kept asking. And we said, no. We said, no. And then finally, Vanessa was the one that actually came to me one night. And she's like, hey, I think we should go.
Wow.
And so we made that decision and we left and we moved to Toronto. So we got married, literally went and backpacked through Southeast Asia for a month and a bit, came back in a week, packed our stuff, and then moved to Toronto.
Wow.
Yeah.
So did you think like, okay, maybe I didn't get my calling wrong. Maybe this was God's plan all along and the pieces are all falling together.
Yeah, falling together. And then, again, as this journey has gone on, I've still really wrestled with this idea of calling. I think I'm called to be many things. I think I'm called to be a good husband. I'm called to be a good coworker, a good friend, all these many things. And I just trust, that God's going to use my gifts, talents, and treasures wherever I am to serve him.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my idea of calling was like, it was wrapped up in this identity of being this or being that.
Right.
And that's been part of this journey of just like, hey, I just get to show up and just be loved because that's who I am.
So good.
I think, and there's a distinction, right? Like you can be called into ministry, but we often, like you said, think that means pastor at a church in a certain role. But it's like, but you can be called into ministry and work as a teacher, loving on kids or, like anything.
Yep.
So, yeah.
So let's continue this journey. So I'm never moving to Toronto. No.
And then you are.
No, you are.
Yeah. Yeah, we landed in Toronto. I started at the church I was at in Mississauga on April 1st. Just a quick little story to add to the pressures of it all. When we landed, Vanessa just bawled her eyes out for literally months. That was her first experience leaving the mountains, moving to the GTA, which is so different for anyone who's ever been to Toronto and out east. Just the culture is so different. Yeah, I started my job as a pastor working. So I was working at this church. I was in charge of youth outreach and the two ministries. So they had a food bank and a clothing loft.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was a lot.
And so, I mean, you've kind of given us a glimpse of the rest of this story, but talk us through how that went, the journey of like settling into your job there and then
the expectations.
The expectation versus reality.
Yeah,
and,
that's
yeah.
Well, I mean, first, right off the bat, right, the individual came into my office first week when I was there and just very plainly said to me, I don't trust you.
Wow.
And I was like, that's a really weird thing to say to someone.
No kidding.
Wow.
And,
especially in a church.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you said your first week?
The first week.
Was it meant to be like, I mean, I don't think there's a really positive way you can put that, but was it meant to be like, I don't know you, so I want to get to know your character a little bit more? Or was it just like,
still,
here's
right?
the line, I'm drawing it, you're
I think
not
I think it could have been that, but it wasn't communicated as that.
Okay.
And so I think there was intention behind it of saying like, I don't trust you.
Not a kind thing to say to anyone. Right?
Yeah. So again, like my experience up to this point of church has been super positive, right? Like everyone I've engaged with out west, you guys, First Alliance, like I had a lot of good friends in ministry, and this was just like so different. That was my first red flag. But again, there was this piece in me that's like, I'm gonna just push that to the side because
you're
I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm called. I'm here to serve God.
Right.
All these different things. You kind of put these red flags, I'd say, under the carpet because it's like, oh, I'm here. Yeah, you're right. I am here. I did move. I literally moved across the country for this job with my brand new wife and marriage and all these things.
What did you say in the moment? Like, what is the response when someone says, I don't trust you?
Do you remember what
How
you
do
said?
you respond?
I don't think I said anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, that's part of this whole journey, right, of church hurt and stuff. It's just like, I can't question you because for some reason you're the leader of this space. You're like there's this weird idea coming under leadership. It's like, I trust you. And again, this was a lot of the language that was communicated, not only to myself, but to Vanessa, my wife, right? Like, we're going to shepherd you. We're going to take care of you. We're here for you. We know you're taking, leaps and bounds to move across the country. And so I kind of just blindly trusted that and followed that. I didn't really say anything.
And, with your experience before, that's been a healthy experience. When people say, oh, like, we care about you, it's a healthy care.
Yeah.
But in a way, it almost sounds like it was a bait and switch.
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so then...
Yeah, so anyways, so time went on. We embedded ourselves into the community, got to know everyone. It was good, I would say, for the most part. We were meeting friends and getting to know people. The youth ministry, though, and actually, sorry, just to rewind, this is an important piece to say. When I went through the interview process with this church, I said, if you're looking for someone to just run a youth ministry, play games on a Friday night, things like that, I said, don't hire me.
It's not you.
I made that very clear.
Yeah.
And I've said that in all of my interviews because I know that I wouldn't be a good fit. Like, I'm just like, that's just not who I am. Mm-hmm. And I said, I'm going to engage with youth and have really hard conversations and, talk about, harm reduction and addiction and what does all this language mean in the church and how do we understand homelessness and poverty and, social location and, how do we understand ourselves in relationship to the community. And so as time went on within the church, again, youth ministry or lack thereof, there at that time too, there wasn't really much to work with. But there was actually a shelter across the road at the mall where my friend Brooker started this youth shelter, and there was tons of inner city kids going to the shelter after school. And I said, sweet, that's where I'm going to go. I said, that's going to be my youth group.
Yeah.
And so I partnered with Brooker, and I was going over there, and we were doing, incredible things and programming. And, when they wanted to do big events, we would use the church and stuff like that. So a lot of things were going really good. Mm-hmm. Again, I met a lot of people there in the central district of the Alliance. But just slowly over time, this idea of like freedom, collaboration, working together started to become more of like, I'm going to rule with an iron fist type thing. And I started to notice just really passive aggressive comments from the leadership there and the leader saying, why aren't you just doing what we tell you? We hired you on to do youth ministry. And I'm not just the type of person that's just going to sit back and just be like, okay. Like I questioned that. I said, well, hold on a second. This isn't why you hired me. Mm-hmm. And I said, let's have a conversation about that. And, I would hear things like, well, you just don't like discipline. And I'm like, I don't think this has anything to do with discipline. I said, like, this is just me trying to have a conversation, right? And then scripture came into it, a lot of gaslighting, things like that, making it sound like, like I was the one who was, making up all these things and not following through. And it became really toxic to the point where I just was not getting along with my boss. We were butting heads a lot. And it just came to the point where I went to him one day and I said, look, like we need to openly talk about this. Because again, there was just all about control. And I said, the more I'm controlled, like the more I'm just going to start fighting back, right, and pushing. And so I went to him and said, like, we need to talk about this. And I was like, maybe we should bring a mediator in. He's like, great, that's a great point. I'll contact my friend. And I said, no. I think we need to have a third party person to come in and to help us figure this out. Mm-hmm. And so we actually ended up getting the DS at the time for the central district to come in and to listen to both sides of our stories. And so what was happening was there was an expectation of what we see you doing, what we heard about what you were doing out west. I think we wanted that, but I don't think the reality of that was being communicated to our church. So we weren't seeing church growth. We weren't seeing, a vibrant youth ministry. We were seeing a couple people trickle in and out of the food bank and clothing loft, but I don't think the expectation and the reality was there. And so I think when that was happening, where maybe there was some fear, became more control of, well, actually, we're going to change your job description to now just be more youth ministry focused. And that just rubbed me the wrong way because I'm just like, I know I'm not wired for that.
Right.
And so the person at the time, the DS, gave us an excellent exercise to do where both my boss and myself were to take my job description and we were supposed to rewrite it into what we think it could look like and then come back together, pray, talk about it, see what works, see what doesn't work, go back, talk about it, don't talk about it, pray, come back, and all these things. So I went away that night. I rewrote the job description based on, original expectations and what I still think could be like. And I made the suggestion. I said, if you want more of like a church pastor, youth pastor in the church specifically for youth ministry stuff, I said, I will cut my salary in half so you can hire somebody part-time. And I will go get a job part-time out in the community in like a shelter. That's who I am. That's where I thrived, things like that. And so I changed all these things. It wasn't much change from the original job description, And I actually sent it to people that I trusted, and I said, hey, is this communicating something that maybe I'm not meaning to communicate? And I've had 3 different people look at it, and everybody gave it the green light. So I sent it to my boss that night, waiting to receive his. I didn't receive it. I received an email saying I need to come to the church the next day because I was being let go.
Wow.
Rug pulled out from under you.
Yeah. So I think what happened, and again, there's so much ambiguity to this, was that my boss received my job description, took it to the elders board, which I later found out, saw it, all the things that I wasn't willing to do. And I was just like, see, this person isn't willing to come under authority. And there was this idea of authority of the Lord and authority of man that was mixed together, which made it super hard for me to unpack after that. And so anyway, so I went in, and of course I was quite upset. And, I said to my boss, I said, you didn't follow through on the expectations that we were told to do. And he said, I don't need him, meaning the DS, to tell me what to do. This is my decision. This is what we're doing.
Wow.
And so I had to leave. I had to sign this binding contract where I couldn't tell anybody about my experience at the church.
Unreal. Hey?
And this was right at the beginning of COVID too, where I actually was one of the first people to get one of the first cases of COVID in Mississauga.
Wow.
So we just moved, had no money, got let go from a church. The community, nobody reached out, or very rarely did they, or they did at the beginning and then it stopped. Being in a brand new place, my wife Vanessa is like so upset. So it just led me down a path of just like this was shattering, like so shattering. The elders, again, this is part of this idea of spiritual and religious harm and hurt and stuff. And I heard the verses, right? It's like, I'm paraphrasing here, but all good things come to those who wait, or just stuff like that, or a lot of like those Christianese verses. And it was just like, you're being sent somewhere better. Like, Zach, like God has a plan for you. It's like, no, but I really think my plan was to be a pastor, and I think I could still very well be a very good pastor for your church. But I think, unfortunately, there was some leadership stuff getting involved. It just didn't work out. But yeah, like I loved what you said. Like the rug was literally pulled out from underneath me.
And then COVID hit.
And then you're like isolated, dealing with this all on your own.
Yeah.
Well, you and Vanessa together, but alone, the 2 of you in a place that isn't really home yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was probably one of the worst times of my life, because it's one thing to be let go from just a job, but it's one thing to be let go from your community.
Yeah.
And to have the person of Christ that you wrap your identity around to just be totally stripped away. And it's like, how do you make sense of this? I felt so lost. I felt so confused. Yeah, I didn't know who I was. I couldn't trust church. I couldn't trust these people who were my friends. And again, in all of that, just this confusion of just like, well, God has a plan for you. But it's like,
how did you wrestle with that?
Yeah.
Here you are. This is a kind of a dream job, right? Of being a pastor, working in a church, in a community, and then it's not there anymore.
I think there was a couple ways to wrestle with it. I actually didn't go to the Christian community, for one, because I felt like there was more harm in the answers that were being given than there was good. And it just...
In what way, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, just, again, going back to those Christianese type verses that maybe we like to use in church sometimes, of God's got his hand on you, God's leading you down this path. And I look back at it now, like based on the education that I have now, especially in psycho-spiritual therapy, we have a term for that. It's called spiritual bypassing. It's where one uses their religious framework or spiritual framework to bypass the emotional experience.
Yeah.
And so I think my situation actually made people very uncomfortable.
And they didn't know what to say.
And they didn't know what to say. They don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And I remember the day I was let go, that Sunday, my boss actually wanted me to come back and preach on the Sunday to tell the church why I was choosing to leave.
Oof.
And so
it doesn't even make sense.
It's interesting, right? Because it's like, here you are dealing with something that you don't have. I think you were saying you wanted to help kids who didn't have language to deal with things earlier. And it's like almost like now you're being met with a church that doesn't have language to deal with when bad things happen. And I think that's like one of the things we can learn from your story. I know you're not done, but I think it's really important for us to learn the language of grieving with those who grieve, like to just, or, be okay with the uncomfortable.
Yeah. And so, like, going back to your question, Corey, about like, what types of things, like, and again, this is all language I have now 4 years later, 3.5 years later, but there's this idea of like disenfranchised grief. And disenfranchised grief or disenfranchised loss is where there's a grieving process that's not openly acknowledged, or it's not acknowledged in a community. people don't really take it seriously. They take it at face value. And so that's what I was finding I was being met with in the Christian community. Again, it was just like this idea of, well, Zach, all leaders fall. We need to have God's grace.
Not really acknowledging the depth of the pain.
Not acknowledging it whatsoever. And I think that's the thing that hurt the most was because the Alliance was my community. Like they were my people and nothing happened. Not that I know of. I mean, people said stuff happened, but I never heard anything about it. I never had a follow-up.
Yeah, no one came to you.
Yeah, I went later, or I actually wrote a letter later to the elders board 3 years later. It wasn't acknowledged. Again, there was this idea where it's just kind of pushed off to the side. And, again, like I would talk to some pastors, like some pastors did come to me, but again, I was being met with these answers of, well, Zach, you've never really been a pastor until you've got some scars. Like that was language I was hearing. And it's almost like that became normal, but it's like, to me, that's really messed up.
It's like the trauma Olympics, right? Like,
yeah.
Oh, well, yeah, I've been hurt too. Like,
Yes.
Okay, but that doesn't make it less hurtful.
Yes.
Or right.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so I think what I was being met with was a lot of sympathy versus empathy.
That's good. Can you just distinguish between those?
Yeah.
People?
So sympathy is a lot of the time where we silver line things. Again, that is where spiritual bypassing comes in. It could sound something like, 5-year-old girl dies in a car accident. And I could say something like, well, heaven gained another little angel.
Oh, yeah.
Things like that, right? We try to make the experience better than it actually is because it makes us feel uncomfortable.
We can move on.
Versus empathy is the ability within oneself to reach within you and to find an experience that you can relate to with that person and just to sit in that with that person.
Empathy is a lot more uncomfortable.
I would say so, yes.
I would say sympathy feels like, okay, I can say the silver lining and then I can move on with my life and don't have to sit in the discomfort.
Yeah. So it's useless. Yeah. It doesn't do anybody any good.
So I'm curious, there was a lot of things that went wrong. What went right? Or was there someone who did handle your situation with empathy that was helpful? Like just thinking of something that maybe we can tangibly learn from of our actions when we're kind of faced with situations that make us feel uncomfortable, or someone who has been hurt.
Or if there wasn't somebody, what would have been helpful?
Yeah, what would have been helpful?
That's a good question. Well, I'm going to take it a step further from empathy. I'm going to introduce the term interpathy, if people don't know what it means.
Oh.
I don't, so.
Yeah, so interpathy is the ability to actually stand in the shoes of the complete and fully other. It's not necessarily just about being able to find something you can relate to, but it's about being in the space of somebody who's totally not like you. And so for me, like I'd mentioned before, the church community became very passive. The people that actually helped me were in my degree. So after that happened, I actually decided to go back to school. So I ended up finding this degree at University of Toronto where I did my master's in psychotherapy and spiritual care. And these were people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds of even the Christian tradition. And these people were totally able to hold me and to stand in space with me, to just be like, Zach, what happened to you was wrong. They didn't have answers. They held me. They held my tears. They helped me make sense of my tears. And so that's what I would say that someone could do, is even if you don't even identify with anything of the other person, it's how can you stand in the place with them and hold them?
Wow.
It's a good question for us to ask whenever, any sort of situation where people are dealing with trauma. How can we stand with them?
And the thing that's interesting about trauma is trauma isn't necessarily what happened to you. It's the reaction of what's happening to you now. It's the perspective of what's going on in you. And so it's being able, again, to be with that person, the place, right? Because to work through trauma, you have to be able to first choose to heal and then feel, which will then reveal. And so when you're able to walk through those steps of just being fully present with a person, you can actually be with them in the traumatic experience. But again, I think it's in that place where it's like, ooh, that's really uncomfortable. I'm going to stand back here and
While you deal with
look at you from a distance.
Yeah. Can you repeat that again?
Yeah. So when it comes to trauma, we first have to choose to feel, not heal. We have to choose to feel. And then we have to choose to deal. So deal with it. And then once we deal with it, it will reveal it. And then we can move into healing. It's kind of like an
Yeah.
iceberg, right? It's like you see the top 10%, but you don't see the 90% underneath.
Yeah, it's funny. I've been going to therapy the last few months, and I was talking to my therapist about inner child stuff.
Yeah.
Not on purpose, though.
The inner critic.
Yeah, well, and
Yeah.
just going through my own childhood and going like, oh, that wasn't normal. That was weird. And you have to like notice these things. And you're right. It's not like in the moment, but like, this is not about me, but I'm just trying to add to this, I guess. But in the moment, you don't notice that you're experiencing a trauma. But it is really when you look back on it, acknowledging it. And then, what did you say first? You have to feel it?
You have to choose to feel it.
Yeah. So you notice it, you feel it.
And then deal with it. You have to choose to deal with it and then feel it. Because oftentimes trauma,
Right.
it's a somatic experience of where is this showing up in your body? Where are you feeling it? And then once we're able to do that, it reveals itself in whatever way. And then from there, we can move towards healing.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting process. And I don't know if that parallels with inner child stuff, right? But it's like you go through and you're almost like acknowledge that wasn't normal. Feel that. It's okay to feel that. And then moving on. And it's, it's really interesting that you said that.
And so like again, so much of this, and when I think of like church hurt and again, the best language, and this was language that I learned in my education of going through and doing a residency in Toronto, was this word called ambiguous loss or ambiguous grief. And ambiguous grief are experiences that have no defined beginning and ending. So it could be like an aging parent who's physically here, but mentally they're gone. Or a child who goes off to war, they go missing in action, and you don't know if they're dead or alive. And that's so much about spiritual and religious abuse and hurt, is that there's an event, but there's no defined ending to it. It's just like, what happened? God, where are you?
You're like floating.
Where's the community?
Yeah.
Wow.
How do I understand, my faith in the authority of God, but also the authority of church that I told I couldn't succumb to? How do I make sense of my calling when this was all wrapped up in God's plans for me and all these different things? And it's just totally eradicated and it's gone. And it's just like, who am I?
So how did you reconcile your faith with that and your relationship with God, but also your relationship with the church, which should be his body? But how do you reconcile that if you're all of a sudden have no trust?
Yeah, I mean, when it rains, it pours type thing. So yeah, like there was a season there where I didn't know who I was. I wasn't sure if I wanted to live, because it's like, if I'm not this person and I don't know who I am, who am I? Like I went through a total existential crisis. I was really turning towards substances to help me cope. And I just realized that this was not wrong and it was helpful. And I became super bitter and I just couldn't make sense of my reality. And like I mentioned, the thing and the people that actually really helped me were in my education. What I realized was that there was actually a bigger body of believers than the body of believers I was a part of. So I was introduced to, so many different types of theologies, like Black theology, feminist theology, queer theology, indigenous theology, and all these different perspectives were able to come around me and to help me in my many parts of me that were hurting, and were able to hold me within that. And they helped me to come to the place where it's okay to not be okay. And I went down the path of deconstruction. And, a lot of people see deconstruction. It's like, oh, you just don't, like you want to deconstruct the Bible and you want to deconstruct church and all these things. But being able to go through the deconstruction journey actually helped me process and also reconstruct my idea of God. Meaning, I think I've really moved from a place of embedded theology to more of a process or deliberative theology. So embedded theology, it sounds like, these were the things that I was raised in, so therefore it's true. This is what I believe. Okay. But when something like this happens to someone, those embedded beliefs don't necessarily work anymore. They're challenged and they don't necessarily take you to where you need to be, versus more of a deliberative or process theology. It's just like, okay, what's the wisdom that I can take from this tradition? How does it help me with where I'm at now? Does it make sense? Does it not make sense? What are the different bits and pieces that I can kind of pick to kind of help me make sense of this? And so it was 3.5, 4 years, and I'm still working on that, of just like, how do I understand myself and how do I make sense of church?
Do you attend a church, or is there a place where you feel like is safe for you?
Yeah, I would personally say I still identify as a Christian. Like I, for the longest time, was wondering, what does that even mean? What does it look like? And so I would say, yeah, I still identify Christian. And I'm still trying to find a church. I haven't landed anywhere. What does that look like? I'm not too sure. A lot of the times I can't define it, but I know it when I feel it.
What did you say? Embedded theology and then processed theology?
Yeah, embedded
yeah.
theology versus process or deliberative theology. Yeah.
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 So it's that deliberative theology that
I
you have
think
to
so.
kind of just really evaluate everything for, okay, what do I actually believe?
Yeah, I think so. And even too, like being introduced to, and again, like this just goes to my world of church, right? Like coming from an evangelical Protestant Reformed tradition versus now, you know, like it was only in my master's where I heard about, you know, the Eastern desert mothers and fathers and the practices of Ignatius and all these mystics and people. And I'm just like, I've never heard this before. And it was in this place of just being to bring myself, to bring my brokenness of just sitting in the mystery of God. That was super healing. And I don't know what that looks like. You know, am I moving towards more of an Eastern Christian, Orthodox Christian tradition? I don't really know, but I'm still on that journey of discovery. But I would say that it's definitely creating the spaces of mystery for God to be is something where I think I could land in.
I don't even know what to say, but I love that about your journey of the discovery of God and resting in the mystery of God. Like that's so challenging to say that there's mystery and that I don't have all the answers, and being okay with that, of like continuing to discover more about who he is and his plan for your life. I want to ask this question, you know, for those people who are listening, who are kind of processing through church hurt, what advice, I guess I would say, like, what advice or how would you speak to someone kind of in the throes of processing being hurt by the church? And it might not be a lead pastor. It could be another person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus, right? Who they've been hurt by.
Yep. I would say find a community, as hard as it is, because I think oftentimes people will remember the process rather than the product. And what I mean by that is when I was, you know, deeply involved in church as a pastor and going regularly on a Sunday and things like that, it was all about the Sunday show. Very rarely did I have the process of community, of authentically asking really hard questions and being okay with that. Because again, with showing up with my Christianity, like, is it Christian enough to be welcomed here? And so I had to find a community that was okay with that. And part of that community actually took me out of the Christian community. But that was where I had some of the most rich, refreshing, beautiful moments of restoration, where people that could just hold me in the process rather than just simply finding the product. Does that make sense?
I've grown up in the church, and I think it's been something I've been trying to unlearn, and I'm learning a lot from you even just as you speak, but just we're not really, or at least I should speak for myself, I didn't grow up learning how to really sit with people in hard things, and it almost seems like people that didn't grow up in the church were sort of less bubble wrapped, and so it's more comfortable for them to embrace the hard things of life, and there's no sugarcoating it, and it seems like I think we need to get better at not sugarcoating everything, and just really, I think what you're saying was really great about the other community that you discovered was that they were just there with you, and they weren't, it's not like they felt like their theology was threatened by your grief.
Yes. Yeah.
And if we really do believe God is who he says he is, then why are we scared to sit in those moments with people?
I'm kind of curious, like, this is a little bit of a side tangent, because I've always been fascinated with also growing up, I feel like in a Christian home, evangelical, just, you know, we celebrated, you know, Easter and Christmas, but not really knowing anything about church history or different theologies. Like, it was very cut and dry, and that's it. Like, there wasn't a lot about, what kind of theology would you say?
Oh, like the Black theology, Indigenous theology.
Like, it's really interesting.
Feminist theology.
Yeah, like there is,
Yep.
like, just the process of these different theologies, and even thinking, going back to like church history and church, like everything that has happened, you know, with celebrating different church history days. Like, there's so much more to faith experience that it's like, I feel like we're always I don't know, for me growing up, it felt like my faith experience was one thing and that was it. And like, you don't question, you don't ask, but there's something about the experience. It's not experiential theology. What did you say? You have
Embedded
theology and
deliberative or process theology.
Process theology, right?
Yeah.
Again, I feel like process theology really invites us into learning more. So I'm curious, what have you learned? If you want to share, I know it's a little bit of a side tangent, but
Yeah, no, that's okay. What have I learned? Yeah,
what things have shifted in your own theology?
In your dismantling.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's good. Like even, for example, the atonement theory, there's several atonement theories. You could probably typically learn this in any seminary or Bible institution, but it's just like, why is the one atonement theory, Christ died on the cross, we're sinners, we need God's grace, type thing. Why is there never room to explore the other atonement theories? What does that look like? What does it look like for you? How do you understand that? Kind of like what I was mentioning earlier before we started, this idea of I can actually affirm, the Apostles' Creed, the resurrection, the virgin birth, all of these things. But when it comes to the point where I have a question around a sexual ethic within the church, then all of a sudden my Christianity isn't Christian enough. So it's like, what degree of separation am I from actually being okay with the Christian orthodoxy where I value these things and I agree to them, but there's certain areas, if I were to question that, then all of a sudden, then I'm not a real Christian, or I'm not a whatever, depending, again, on the community you're involved in.
It's a good question.
And I also feel, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. When we were voting as a church on having women as elders, our lead pastor said, listen, this is not central to our faith. Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it's not the end all be all of our faith. And so he said it was like, if you could think of a circle, like this is not the inner circle, this is a second circle thing, like, this is not critical. So I feel like that's sort of what you're wrestling with. Like, these are not things that are hills to die on, but they are important and they do matter, and the first circle informs the second circle, I guess. But I'm curious, what are the other atonement theories? Or you don't have to go through all of them. But
I don't know them all off by heart, but there's several atonement theories. Or like even in our Sunday services, it's just like, why don't we hear from Black liberation theology or feminist theology or all these different types of ideas? Because again, when you switch that narrative, when the power's taken away or when the authority's in question, because there's another perspective, it changes the whole story. I shouldn't say it changes the whole story, but it changes perspectives, right? So that's kind of been this idea of me, and that's something that I had to wrestle through, because I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Right.
I had to help myself, and I want to help other people find other paths forward, because there are other paths, and it doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but how do we journey them? How do we journey them well? How do we understand ourselves? Again, so currently I actually work as a psycho-spiritual therapist at Kelowna General Hospital and a registered clinical counselor. And language that I've really started to adopt into my practice is this idea of co-creation. And I think there's a beautiful space of co-creation between us, God, and creation. And what does that really look like? And I don't necessarily think you can get there with embedded theology, because I think it doesn't leave room for curiosity and co-creation to a certain degree of really going deeper and understanding ourselves, the world, and the mystery of God.
Sorry, can you explain co-creation just a little bit more?
Yeah, so co-creation is kind of this idea where it's not just one side speaking into the idea or speaking into the situation, yet it's a shared space of two people coming together to co-create and to kind of co-authorship this story, this idea, this narrative. And that's kind of where I've landed myself being, I really have found myself. It's funny. It's like, I think I'm becoming more of like a church mystic, because it's like, how do I become more in authorship and in partnership with the mystery of God? And that has actually come out of this place of hurt.
And is that how you've reconciled your calling? What you were calling your calling, and now it's sort of like, okay, but there was human elements of that as well.
Yeah.
It's not as mystical as it once seemed.
Yeah, well, I think, going back to what I originally said, I think I got calling wrong, and I think we teach calling wrong in certain areas. I'm called to be many things. Like I mentioned, I'm called to be a good husband, a good friend, a good colleague, and I trust that God's going to use my gifts, talents, and treasures to honor him. But ultimately, what I've realized is that I'm just called just to be loved. That like I'm called to just be who I am and to sit in that, and there's no expectations. I just get to be loved by God, and that has probably been the biggest thing. Again, going back to that question about or what we were talking about trauma, about like our inner child and stuff, and at one point right there was a defense put in place to protect that inner child, because that inner child was hurt, or there was something there, and we all have defenses. Doesn't matter if it's addiction or if it's eating too much, sleeping too little, or whatever, but that actually needs to be honored, because at one point in your life it kept you safe. But if you're not aware of it, over time it actually slowly starts to turn against you.
Right.
And it starts to inhibit you experiencing the deeper parts of who you are. And so for me, throughout that whole thing, my defense was actually found in God, because I was angry. I was seeing God as part of the church hurt, because there was the manipulation of Scripture. And what I really had to realize was that those were two totally separate things. And by being able to do that, I'm actually able to sit in the love of God. But it's a journey.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone? What would you say to your younger self? I like asking that question. Like, what would you say to, just graduating high school, Zach? And what would you say to him?
I would probably say it's okay to be scared, because it gives you something to be courageous about. And
You just came up with that? Just write that down. Wow. It's okay to be scared because it gives you something to be courageous about.
Yeah. And courageous meaning, as I think about this, I remember in high school, especially in church and youth group, they're like, don't be peer pressured by your friends, blah, 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 drugs, alcohol, sex, all these things. And I would tell myself, don't be peer pressured by the church. Don't be peer pressured by the church, where it's like, you have to think this, you have to think that to belong. But it's like, no, I just get to show up, and I get to be courageous to enter into that, just to be loved.
I love so much of what you've said, and I think it's something that we need to get better at as a church, is being okay with being, I like you said, curious. And I think that's something that is easily squashed in a church if we feel scared that the answers will lead us away from our theology that's been embedded for so long. So I love that you're saying it's okay to be curious and just ask questions, because I think, we are being loved by God, and I think he wants us to be his kids, right? And what are kids? Kids are really curious, and they ask all these questions that they're not supposed to ask. And, and I think that's a really cool season that you're entering into, of just asking questions and still finding them in God. So I think that's cool.
Yeah.
Would you say that's accurate, that that's where you're at?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
I don't want to speak for you. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing this story. I know it's probably not easy to relive those moments, but thank you for being honest and vulnerable. And it's a challenging but good conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I know even for myself, this has been so wonderful. And I know we've sat down and had lots of chats throughout the years, but it's been really good to sit here and listen and learn from you, how I can be a better follower of Jesus, but also what a beautiful reminder just to end on, just to be loved by God, to rest in his love, and know that's enough.
Yep.
So yeah, thank you, Zach, for coming on and bearing it all, and really appreciate your wisdom, insight, and just being able to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks.
So here we are. That was quite the episode. Like I said at the beginning, lots to learn, lots to take away, lots of things to think about. I know there's a few points that he mentioned of just that it's okay to not be okay. I mean, giving ourselves permission to not be okay. Like it's okay to not be okay. But I absolutely loved just landing on that he felt called to be loved by God.
I loved that.
Yeah, like that's his calling,
Yeah.
right? To be loved by God. And how true for all of us to know that, like, regardless of what is happening, in our life circumstances or where we ended up or thought we, you know, like, how did we end up here? But it's really, truly to know that we are loved by God.
Yeah.
And that's enough.
And that's enough. Yep. And I so agree with you. I also really loved what he talked about. I might get the term wrong, but I think it was interpathy. No.
Interpathy.
It's like the step beyond empathy.
Getting in someone's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I really like that because I think that's something that for myself I need to work on, but I think probably all of us to some degree could work on moving from sympathy to empathy to interpathy.
That's the next level.
It really is, because it is easy to just offer the token, I'll pray for you. I mean, that's nice. We should pray for each other. Or, you know, God's got this, or God's got his hand on your life. And I do believe that, yes, God is guiding us and loves us, but I also know that that's not a helpful statement to say to somebody when they're in the midst of hurt. And that actually is like, it would be better to say nothing. And so, it's a good thing for me to think about, just walking in someone's shoes as best as I can.
He also had this quote, I just have to say it again. Mm-hmm. It's okay to be scared because it gives you something to be courageous about.
Yeah. And also that he came up with that in 5 minutes. Smart guy, right?
That is, smart guy, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, like, going back, it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to be scared because it gives you something to be courageous about. And so I think, listener, may you know that you're loved by God, and may you be courageous, even through some times that might be a little scary.
Yeah.
Be courageous.
I think on both sides, right? If you've been in that place where you're the one that's been hurt, it takes a lot of courage. But also, if you have been the person that, you know, should be there for someone who's been hurt, it can be scary to go there with your feelings too, right? And so there's, lots to be courageous about.
Yeah. So thank you, Zach, for another wonderful episode on the Can We Ask You This podcast. I just want to say thank you to Ryan, our editor, and just the time and energy that he gives. We appreciate him so much. If you enjoyed this episode, we always appreciate a review, or on Apple Podcasts, I think you can star it at the very least. We'd appreciate that.
5 star.
Yeah. Oh yeah, not a star, 5 star.
5 stars. We
5
appreciate
stars.
only 5.
Yeah, I think if you've appreciated this podcast, I think that's something simple that we'd love for you to do for us. So thank you.
Thank you for listening, and
until next time.
Yeah, have a great rest of your, I don't know what you're doing today. We need to figure out an outro.
We do, but that's okay.
All right.
Okay, see you, friends.
Bye.